Good morning. Happy Sabbath. Welcome again, guests. I'll be reading the scripture this morning. It's Luke 6:47 through 49. If you like to read along, Luke 6:47 to 49. Whosoever cometh to me and heareth my sayings and doeth them, I will show you to whom he is like. He is like a man which built a house and digged deep and laid the foundation on a rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently upon that house and could not shake it, for it was founded upon a rock. But he that heareth and doeth not is like a man that without a foundation built a house upon the earth, against which the stream did beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. May the Lord bless this reading. Amen.
There was a boy who had a litter of cats, and he went out to the Republican National Convention, the Democrat National Convention, and he started to sell the cats, and he says, Democrat cats for sale, Democrats cats for sale. And the people passing by were looking at the cats and noticing the cats, and he was trying to sell them. Well, a couple weeks later, it was the Republican National Convention, and the same boy was out there, and he was saying, Republican cats for sale, Republican cats for sale. And one of the members of the press came by and he noticed that boy there and he said, you were the same boy that was selling the Democrat cats at the last Democrat National Convention. And the boy was like, yeah, but eyes open. So that was a joke told by President Ronald Reagan back in the 80s. And I thought it was funny. And it also was kind of interesting because this is the first Sabbath after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. And if you remember, Ronald Reagan was also had an attempted assassination on him by John Hinckley. And it just seems that whenever something like this happens, a big event that sparks a lot of interest, the mainstream story is just not believable. And it was like this with John F. Kennedy when he was shot. Despite numerous witnesses all attesting to the fact that they heard many shooters, the press circled in on the theory that there was only one, Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald had suspicious background in the Communist Party, but we'll never know much about Lee Harvey Oswald because he was later killed by Jacob Rubenstein. Jacob Rubenstein, after he was caught and apprehended by the police, said that he had no memory of what happened, didn't know where he was, didn't know what he was doing, and didn't remember anything about what had just happened with the assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald. He later went crazy, rambling on about how the Jews were going to be attacked. His motive for the assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald was that he wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy the rigors of going through a trial. None of which really makes sense for an assassination. And similarly for this last one, apparently a young 20-year-old boy carrying a ladder and a rifle went to one of the most crowded events that can take place, a convention by President Trump, put up the ladder, climbed the roof, upon which there were no police, was within 400 feet of the president, and took about 3 shots, whereupon you hear another different caliber rifle firing, and then was later shot by the Secret Service. And again, it just seems like that whole series of events opens up a whole series of questions that need to be answered, but probably never will be. And I just thought that I should make a few remarks about that, since this is one of the biggest things that has happened in our lifetime. And if we remember where we are in prophetic history, we're in the stage of Revelation 13, when the lamb-like beast that rises up out of the earth will start speaking like a dragon. And that is followed shortly thereafter by miracles, the raising of an image to the beast before it, who, if you remember, was the biggest persecutor of God's people that ever existed, the Roman Catholic Church. And shortly thereafter is the mark of the beast. People receive the mark of the beast or the seal of God. And thereafter, the close of Earth's history as we know it. So we're getting close to the end. My sermon does tie into the end times, because I'd like to talk about two other previous foreshadowings of the time of the end, the very end. My contention is that every end and foreshadowing of the end of the world has come with a flood. And those floods have been preceded by a prophet, and those prophets have warned a remnant which have survived. And my contention is that this will happen in the future again. Okay? Interestingly enough, each one of those major floods occurs in approximately 2,000-year intervals. And we're now very close to that next 2,000-year interval. The first one occurred with Noah and his flood. Now, if you go back in Genesis and you look at Genesis 5 and the genealogies of the men who lived during that time, you'll find one man who stands out in that history. His name is Methuselah. He's famous because he is the longest living man in Bible history. He lived 969 years, even longer than Adam did. His name is interesting because it is a prophecy itself. He was the son of Enoch, and Enoch, prophesied about the coming end of the world. But miraculously, he was taken to heaven before he ever saw it. But he prophesied about the end time coming. And you can read about his prophecies in the book of Jude. He had a son, and his son spoke of the same prophecy, because his name was significant, like many Bible names. His name was Methuselah, and if you look in Hebrew, Genesis chapter 1 says that if you touch of the tree of this fruit, you will surely die, right? The word in Hebrew is mut to mutun. It means in dying, you will die the death. Mut is the root word in Hebrew for death. If you look at Methuselah, the first part of his name is the same root word for death, mut. And Selah means it will be sent. Okay, so on his death, it will be sent is the translation of Methuselah's name. Methuselah was 189 years old when his son Lamech was born. Lamech was the father of Noah, and he had his son Noah when he was 182 years old. Noah was 600 years old when the flood came. If you add 600 to the 182 years of Lamech when he had his son, the total comes to 782 years. If you add 782 years to the 189 years old that Methuselah was when he had Lamech, the total comes to 969 years. The very day that he died, the very year that he died, was the year that the flood was sent. So on his death, it will be sent. The flood came right about that time. So his death was a prophecy to the people living around. And when Methuselah died, it must have been an ominous and scary thing. But we know what happened during that time. The flood came. Noah entered that flood, regarding the prophecy of God, he built the ark, where he and his family entered in. The doors of the ark were shut by an unseen hand, because the door was so large he couldn't close it. It only closed from the outside, and it was so big that he wasn't able to close it. Someone else closed it. An angel closed it and sealed it. So he was sealed. So there was a sealing at the time of the flood, and Noah and his family were sealed inside. For 7 days, it lingered before the actual rain came. So there was a period of time before the judgment was actually executed. And Noah was saved through the floods, just like in the end time, God's people will be saved through the 7 last plagues that are finally poured out. And he survived those floods and repopulated the earth. Then there was another flood in the middle of Earth's history. This flood you might not know about. I'm going to read about it to you. If you turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 9. In Daniel chapter 9, you have one of the most amazing prophecies about the birth of Jesus Christ. It says in that prophecy, I will outline it so that we don't have time to go through every little bit of it. But there were 490 years. The 490 years comes from the 70 weeks. And if you look in Bible prophecy, a day is given for a year in Bible prophecy. 70 weeks is 490 days. 490 days from the decree to allow the Jews to return from their captivity in Persia back to Jerusalem was in the year 457 BC. Counting 490 years to that time, you get the close of the ministry to the Jews with the stoning of Stephen in the book of Acts, where you find Paul consenting to Stephen's death. And thereafter, the ministry of Paul spreads the gospel to the entire world through the rest of the book of Acts. But if you look at one specific verse in the prophecies of Daniel chapter 9, there's something very interesting. If you look at Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, there's some mysterious verses there. And I think that there's a message for us. It says in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, after 62 weeks, that's 62 weeks, shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince shall come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. So if you look at this verse, there's a mention of a flood. Okay? There's mention of another flood that occurred. Now, before Jesus died, he had ample opportunity to warn his disciples about what was coming. And you'll find a lot of information about the coming end of the world in their mind in Matthew 24, in Luke 23, and in Mark 13. But in Matthew 24, you get a couple of main events that you'll find. One of them is earthquakes, natural disasters. Another one is famines. Another is pestilences. And another is wars and rumors of wars. Now, these things were specifically mentioned to Peter and his disciples, who wondered when the ending of the temple would come. Because if you remember, the context of Matthew 24 is the disciples wondering when the temple would be destroyed. And Jesus said that all these things would be warm up before the temple was destroyed. And it's also interesting that if you look back in history, you find that all those things actually did occur before the coming of the Romans to destroy the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Jesus warned in Matthew 24 about false prophets. If you look in Acts, in the book of Acts, Remember, there is the mention of one named Theudas in Acts chapter 5, verse 36, who was at that time very popular and deceived many of the people. So there were false prophets before the coming of the Roman armies that destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. There was also many others. A historian said that there was one out of Egypt that said he was a prophet. And there was another prophet that Josephus writes about. Josephus says, "Now as for the affairs of the Jews, they grew worse continually, for the country was again filled with robbers and impostors who deluded the multitude. Yet did Felix catch and put many to death of those impostors every day, together with the robbers." If you remember, also the Bible records another false prophet whose name was Simon. Simon was the one who wanted money to have the Holy Spirit, if you remember that. And that's in Acts chapter 8, verse 9 and 10. But people who knew him and who were convinced of his ministry said that he was the great power of God at that time. Another one that historian writes about was Dostheus, the Samaritan, who also wished to persuade the Samaritans that he was the Christ predicted by Moses, and appears to have gained some over to his views. There were also numerous wars and conflict. The historian Josephus wrote his entire history book called The Wars of the Jews about this time period. Tacitus, a Roman historian, wrote about the months leading up to 70 AD, about the strife that was there during his time. This is a quote from Tacitus's history. "I am entering on the history of a period rich in disasters, frightful in its wars, torn by civil strife, and even in peace full of horrors. 4 emperors perished by the sword. There were 3 civil wars. There were more with foreign enemies. There were often wars that had both characters at once." So there's all these things going on before the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. There was also famines, pestilences, and earthquakes. In AD 51, Tacitus wrote, "This year witnessed many prodigies. Houses were flattened by repeated earthquakes. Further portents were seen in shortages of corn, resulting in famine. In this year, war broke out between Armenians and Iberians, seriously disturbed relations between Rome and Parthia." And another quote from Tacitus, "Heaven too marked the crime-stained year with tempest and pestilence. Campania was ravaged by a hurricane which destroyed houses, orchards, and crops. At Rome, a plague devastated the entire population. No miasma was discernible in the air, yet the houses were full of corpses, and the streets of funerals. Neither sex nor age conferred immunity. Slave or free, all succumbed to die just as suddenly." Suetonius wrote about a series of droughts that caused a scarcity of grain. Seneca the Younger, writing about a specific earthquake in AD 60, stated, "This tremor was on the 5th of February in the consulship of Regulus and Verginius, and it inflicted devastation in Campia. For the part of the town, Herculaneum too fell down, even structures that remain are unstable." Tacitus noted that an earthquake too demolished a large part of Pompeii before 70 AD. So all these things were happening, just as Jesus said. It's not only for our time. Those things were happening in the lead up to 70 AD. And 70 AD was the time that Jerusalem was destroyed. And Jerusalem was so devastated that not one stone remained on another. You can see how the second flood was the flood of Roman armies, who came and destroyed that place and swept it all away. There wasn't anything that remained of Jerusalem at that time. And that is why in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, he talks about the coming, Daniel talks about the coming and prophecy of a flood that will come and destroy Jerusalem in the end times. Jesus warns his followers in Matthew 24, this ominous warning. "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet, let him that readeth understand. Stand in the holy place, then flee." That warning was not only for the people at that time. A lot of these prophecies have dual meaning. They had a meaning for the literal people who were there, and also a spiritual meaning for the people at the end of time. To prove that, I quote to you 1 Corinthians chapter 10, which says that the things in the Old Testament happened for ensamples to us upon whom the ends of the world are come. So those things are lessons for us to learn about the end times. Matthew 24 is a prophecy for us, just as much it was a prophecy for the Christians who live in Jerusalem in the lead up to the Roman armies coming. Now, if you know anything about that time, it was a miraculous event that any Christian saved and survived. The first thing that happened was all the things that I just mentioned, the lead up, the warnings, the earthquakes, the pestilences, the famines, and the wars were all warning Christians that the end was coming soon. Then there was a Roman emperor a Roman general who came and surrounded the city. He surrounded the city and he raised his flags because the city was under siege by the Roman army. Then for some reason, he retreated, and all the Roman army went back far enough so that anyone who wanted to would be able to leave Jerusalem, and there was no more threat. At that time, Christians knew that the warnings of Jesus in Matthew 24 were coming to a pass. The holy place was Jerusalem in their mind. They knew that. And the abomination of desolation, the flood that was coming in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, was this Roman army who was coming to destroy them. And so every Christian who was there and believed these prophecies left, just like Noah left and went into the flood. It was sealed in. They left, and the Romans came back, and the Romans destroyed the city, and they destroyed almost everyone. The famine leading up to that time was so bad that women were eating their own children and cooking them alive. People were starving to death. They were worried about losing all of their wealth, so they decided to swallow their gold, and the Romans ripped them up looking for it. And they killed 2,000 Jews in that manner. They removed every single stone because the gold that was on the temple melted in between the cracks of the stones. And so they wanted to get all of it. Some of those stones weighed hundreds of tons, and somehow they managed to remove them all. The only part of the city that remained is a Wailing Wall outside on the edge that still standing there today. The rest of the city was completely ruined. Then there's the third flood, the flood coming at the end of the world. Now, how do I know it's a flood? Well, here's a few verses. Consider these verses. Psalm 29, verse 10. Look at that verse. Psalm 29, verse 10 says that the Lord sitteth upon the flood. Yea, the Lord sitteth king forever. Amos chapter 9, verse 5 says that the Lord God of hosts is he that toucheth the land, and it shall melt. Oh, we got something here. Okay. Okay. Yeah. How's the volume? Everything good? Can you hear me? Okay. Amos 9:5 is the next verse. And the Lord God of hosts is he that toucheth the land, and it shall melt. And all that dwell therein shall mourn, and it shall rise up wholly like a flood, and shall be drowned as by the flood of Egypt. Okay? So this flood isn't water because it's melting things. It's obviously a flood of fire. The next flood that's going to overcome the earth is a flood of fire. The first one was a flood of water. The next one was a flood of Roman armies. The last one will be a flood of God's angels who are literally so bright and burning, they will melt everything on the earth. The next reason I feel like the next flood is of fire is that Jesus, in his parable about the end of the world, or his warning and prophecy about the end of the world, likens the end of the world to the flood that took place in Genesis. Matthew 24, verse 38 through 39 says, "For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah took them into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. It shall be exactly the same as in those days of the flood, because the events are going to be so similar. And the even coming deluge of fire is going to resemble and have the traumatic effects that the flood of water did on the earth the first time." And Revelation 19, verse 20, notice this: "The beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, and with which he deceived them that received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone." Now, if you know anything about the end times, you know what happens to the devil. He is chained down here to the earth that has literally been completely melted. Remember, there's verses that talk about this, the heavens departing like a scroll, the elements burning as a fervent heat. This is all found in 1 Peter, let's see, 1 Peter chapter 3, I believe. Anyway, you guys know what I'm talking about. Yeah, if I quote sort of loosely from memory. The heavens departing like a scroll, the elements burning like a fervent heat. That means everything that's on the earth, all the mountain dirt, everything is just burning with a fervent heat and melting because of the presence of the Lord who's approaching earth. He's so hot and bright that he's literally burning everything. This earth literally turns into a molten sea of fire, and the devil and the beast are cast down into this earth for 1,000 years. And this earth is basically likened to a lake of fire burning with brimstone. Something else interesting, and why I believe that the last flood is a flood of fire, is that if you go back to Isaiah and you look in Isaiah chapter 33, this is very interesting. Isaiah 33 and verse 14 says that the sinners in Zion are afraid. Fearfulness hath surprised the hypocrites. Who among us shall dwell with devouring fire? Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings? So Isaiah is posing a question. Who's going to be able to live in eternal fire? Oftentimes you hear that sinners are punished forever in an eternal burning hell. But I feel the devil has turned this completely 180 degrees on its head about the truth of what this verse is talking about. The saved will dwell with everlasting burnings, because God is literally burning with an everlasting fire. Who's going to survive that time? Isaiah answers in the next verse. He that walketh righteously and speaketh uprightly, he that despiseth the gain of oppressions and shaketh his hands from holding bribes, that stoppeth his ears from hearing of blood and shutteth his eyes from seeing evil. So the righteous are going to dwell with everlasting burnings, because the Lord is on fire, or from our earthly point of view, seems to be on fire, and will literally melt everything. So there's going to be a flood of water. There was a flood of water. Then there was a flood of Roman armies. Then the next flood will be the 10,000 times 10,000 angels, who are all brighter than we can even open our eyes to behold. And when they unveil their glory, they will be so hot that the elements will melt. The earth will melt. And the only way that we can survive that flood is to take Jesus' advice. So how do we survive that flood? That's the point of this message. How do we survive that flood? Well, in Luke chapter 6, verse 48, there's advice about how to survive floods. Okay, how to build a house that will survive a flood. Would you all like to build a house that will survive a flood? Amen. So would I. I'm interested in buying some country property. And we're looking around, and we want to make it flood-proof. But I don't think that we'll be able to find the right kind of materials on this earth to do that. These days, there's lots of people traveling to and fro looking for remote locations, buying old missile bunkers and refitting them and making them into housing. You know, those missile bunkers are so deep and so secure, made with so much cement that they can survive a nuclear explosion. In fact, if you remember there was an explosion in Arkansas, the Damascus explosion, where there was a worker who was working with a wrench on a thermonuclear warhead, and he accidentally dropped it, and it pierced the fuel tank. And this stuff is so explosive that it's what it's called, I believe, hydraulic. It's not like traditional, it's not like a regular like firecracker that you need to light on fire. It just needs to mix with another fluid and it explodes. So this explosive fluid was leaking out of this thermonuclear warhead. And something strange about these warheads is that they actually can't support their own weight. They need to be filled with fuel to support their weight. So when the tank started emptying, it started to become unstable. And they were trying to figure out what to do, how they could fix it. But they can't go in there because the gas from the fuel is so poisonous that anyone who entered that part of the silo would die. And so eventually the thing exploded. And there's people in the room right next to it. And fortunately, only the detonation materials for the nuclear bomb went off and exploded the whole thing. But the people in the room right next to it were fine, because those things are designed to survive those kind of explosions. They can do that. And so people are buying those right now. Rich people these days are trying to buy these things so that they know that the flood is coming. Wealthy people can see it happening. As a matter of fact, there's a very strange thing going on in the lead up to Trump's assassination attempt. If you know, have you ever heard of the company named BlackRock? And the company, I can't remember, I didn't come to think of, I wasn't thinking about this beforehand, but I just thought I'd share it with you now. There's another investment company that took out an unusual amount of how do you say this? Short positions. A short position is when you're betting on a stock price decreasing on Donald Trump's company in the day before he was shot, and also on the company Rumble. Almost like they knew if he was killed, Donald Trump's company would collapse in share price. Except he miraculously survived. And that short didn't go so well. So, but yeah, people, and there was also, this same company has been involved in shorts doing this for the same thing and other disasters that have happened before this. In 9/11, why did the people that own the building take out large insurance policies right before the building was crashed? And they took it out for fire damage. So somehow all these people know about things coming to pass before we do. And that's why they're going around and buying all these secret properties and trying to survive the coming flood. They're trying to build up a house that will survive the deluge of fire, the strife, the earthquakes that I just told you about. They're trying to figure out a way to get around Matthew 24. Well, the same thing happened to the Babel builders in Genesis chapter 10. They tried to build up a tower so tall that it would survive any flood like the one that had came and swept away the world before. But God came and cast down that flood with lightning and dispersed everyone to the far reaches of the globe. So we can't survive the flood by building a strong house made out of cement, even though that's what this parable says. So let's go into this parable and look at it for 1 second. Luke chapter 6, verse 48, 47 and 48. Whosoever cometh to me and heareth my sayings and doeth them, I will show you whom he is like. He is like a man which built a house and digged deep and laid the foundation on a rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently upon that house and could not shake it, for it was founded upon a rock. But he that heareth and doeth not is like a man that without a foundation built a house upon the earth, against which the stream did beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. So the man did some things right in construction. He digged deep. He went down to the rock. He laid the foundation strong on a strong platform. And I believe that many of probably the Babel builders did the same thing. The men that tried to make the tower to heaven, Nimrod and all of his friends. I'm sure they dig down deep. They built it on the bedrock, like many of the buildings in New York are founded on the strong rock there. They did so because they knew that it would survive shaking if it's on the earth's rocks. On the other hand, there was a man who was foolish and built it on the sand, built it on the shaky ground. In Luke, it says on the earth. In Matthew, it says he built it on sand, on something that wouldn't hold when the streams came and the river overflowed its banks. But Jesus isn't talking about building with regular materials, although this is good as far as it goes. It's nice to build a strong house. This is good construction advice. Anyone who's in construction knows that you need to go down to bedrock to build your house. You need to go down a few feet to lay the footer down for your house. You need to have a solid foundation to do so. And you need to have it inspected to make sure you go down to the right depth so it won't freeze or crack. But that's good as far as it goes. But Jesus is talking always in spiritual terms, he's always talking in spiritual terms, although his words might have a literal meaning. So in this case, we know he's not talking about, building us a strong house to try to survive the end time. That won't work. We can't lay up for ourselves all these treasures on earth, all these secret chambers, all these places that are going to survive the flood. It's not going to happen. You won't be able to survive the flood at the end time if that's how you're building, if that's what you're counting on. But you do need to build. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 9. There's a verse I want to show you. We do need to build, but it's just not in the way that most people think. Notice how Paul takes up this same metaphor himself. Look at this. So, Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, he says, "For we are laborers together with God. Ye are God's husbandry, ye are God's building. According to the grace of God which is given unto me, as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But let every man take heed how he buildeth thereupon. For other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ." Interesting, right? So the rock that Jesus was talking about wasn't earthly rock. It was himself. That's the foundation we need to be building on. You can't build on another foundation other than that. If you try to build, in secret places and do all these things and store up things, those are good as long as they go. It's good for a time of trouble. But to survive the time of trouble and go through the flood, you need to build upon the foundation of the true rock, Jesus Christ. He says that no other foundation no man can lay no other foundation, which is Jesus Christ. For other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Christ is the rock that is the foundation of our house. Now continuing on in this, there's several good verses that you need to consider. Now, if any man build upon this foundation gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire. And the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. Why a fire? Because the next flood is a flood of fire. God is a burning fire. And if you can't look on God because you're not righteous, you won't survive it. You'll be burned up. If any man's work abide, which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive reward. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. So we need to be building up God's temple. The house that God is talking about in the parable of Luke and of Matthew about building a foundation that will survive the flood is building up the temple. The foundation is Christ. Each one of us are stones in the temple, and the temple is the only house that will survive the flood. Okay? Let me prove this to you that we are building up a temple. Here's something interesting. Do you know in Amos chapter 9, verse 11, the chapter that I've quoted to you before about a flood of fire? And Amos, continuing on in the same book of the Minor Prophets, in verse 11, it says, in that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen. The tabernacle of David was the temple, and close up the breaches thereof. I will raise up his ruins, and I will build it as in the days of old. He's talking about in the very last days, the temple of God will be raised up again. The building that is going to be repaired is the temple, and we are all part of the temple. Now, let me read you a verse from Peter. I think I know what it is. 1 Peter 2, verse 5. Turn there. This is an amazing verse. Now listen to this. Ye also, as lively stones, are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. So what does he say we are? We are stones that are built up into a spiritual house. The spiritual house is the temple. That's the only spiritual house that can be. And each one of us are a stone in the spiritual temple. You ever wonder why in Revelation it says that there was no temple found there? There's no need of one, because each one of us is a stone in the temple. That's interesting. Each one of us are building up our characters to be a stone in the temple at the end time. Now, in flood in the first time, there were exact dimensions that we needed to build the ark. There was 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. Those were the exact dimensions. In the end times, there are also exact dimensions that we need to be built, It is 12,000 times 12. It's a 12-dimensional hypercube with 12,000 people spanning it. That's 144,000 people that are sealed, making up that temple. It's interesting how the dimensions are used as well. And how do we build upon that temple? How do we find the blueprints to build that temple? It says in Revelation how to do that. If you look in Revelation, it says that here are they that keep the commandments of God, right? And have the testimonies of Jesus. That's how you get yourself sealed as a stone in the building. You keep the commandments of God. Noah kept the commandments of God, followed his ways, followed his laws. And because of that, he was moved by faith to build the ark, and then he was sealed inside. The Christians in the flood, when the Romans came, followed the laws of Jesus, were looking at his prophecies, and for that reason, they survived. If we're going to survive the flood at the end time, we need to keep all 10 of his commandments. And the ark will keep us safe. Did you know that in the end time, the ark is seen once again? If you go into Revelation and you look after the seventh trumpet is blown, in verse 19, in chapter 11, Revelation chapter 11, verse 19, this is the blowing of the seventh trumpet. And one more time, you see the ark. This is the last place that the Bible mentions the ark. And it says in verse 19, and the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament. And there were lightnings and voices and thunderings. an earthquake, and a great hail. That's important because the last vision of the ark, right at the sounding of the seventh trumpet, right at the close of Earth's history, people see the ark again. And if you remember, in the Old Testament times, it was the ark that kept the armies of Israel invincible because they kept all of the commandments. When they were keeping all 10 commandments, they were invincible. Now, if you notice, when they started to treat it as a mere form, the ark no longer had any protection for them. Just like if we build a strong house on a strong rock, and that's what we trust in, it will be swept away by the flood that's coming, the flood of fire. But if we're keeping all 10 commandments, and we believe that we're lively stones, living stones that are built in the temple of God, we will survive the flood. That's why it's so important to obey and trust God in the end times, to keep all 10 commandments. And that's why this vision and revelation is given to us, opening the temple, opening the most holy place, and exposing the ark. Where are the 10 commandments? That's where they were kept. And that's why they're showing them to us at the end of time, because God wants to lay special importance on the keeping of the 10 commandments in the very end of time, because he knows that for 2,000 years of Christian history, one of the commandments has been almost forgotten. And now, in this overspreading abomination of scientific atheism, almost all of the rest of them are being forgotten and trampled underfoot, every single one. Now it's no good to talk to someone about keeping the 10 commandments because people have no idea about any of the other ones. There are people who legitimately believe that the most important commandment in our relationship of man to man, killing another person, is no longer important these days. People believe that one whole segment of the population, because of their political beliefs, should be wiped off the face of the earth now. And that's how certain people believe now. So nowadays, it is so important to emphasize the obedience of God to his 10 commandments.
Till we meet waiting o'er you. Smite death's threatening way before you. God be with you till we meet again.